Anyone who is bilingual knows that you can speak two different languages and say the same basic thing. Each language adds nuance and layers of meaning to the other. Science and faith are two languages that can work together to say the same thing and add a depth of our understanding and experience of God. In this 4-week series, we'll work toward becoming bilingual with our faith and science languages. In the end, we'll experience a richness in speaking both.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and all that was in them. Then God looked over all he had made, and God saw that it was very good. The story of creation in Genesis tells of God creating the creatures of the water and the creatures of the air and the creatures of the land. God creates Adam and places him in a garden with clear instructions on what he can eat. And then God creates Eve to be a partner to Adam. Then Adam and Eve eat fruit from a forbidden tree. And where before they were unaware of their nakedness, after they ate from the forbidden tree, they became ashamed of their nakedness. Where before they enjoyed a sort of guileless relationship with God, now they were hiding. And where before they had peace in their relationship with each other, after they ate from the forbidden tree, they blamed each other for their mistakes. And so the Lord God banished them from the Garden of Eden and sent Adam out to cultivate the ground from which he had been made. This story is at the beginning of the first book in our Old Testament. It's the beginning of the beginning. And later, after Jesus has lived and died and the church is born, a letter is written to a body of believers in Rome. And in one part, the author, probably the Apostle Paul, references this Adam and Eve story, saying, yes, Adam's one sin brings condemnation for everyone, but Christ's one act of righteousness brings a right relationship with God and new life for everyone. Because one person disobeyed God, many became sinners. But because one other person obeyed God, many will be made righteous. The author here is drawing a connection between Adam and Jesus. And where sin came into the world through one person, Adam, and then affected all of humanity, freedom from sin also comes through one person, Jesus, and is offered to all of humanity. I find a lot of hope in this passage that this new life is for everyone. But this passage, alongside other verses like all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory, and there's no one righteous, not even one, they've been used to build a doctrine that we call original sin. Now, I think all of us can look around and we see pain. We see brokenness in our world. We see ways that we've hurt people and have been hurt by other people. And another word for that might be sin. And original sin is responding to that question, where does this pain come from? Where does sin come from? With the answer that it comes from our ancient ancestors, Adam and Eve, and it's passed on to every human from birth. We're in week 3 of a series that we're calling God Speaks Science. And in this series, we're working to learn the language of faith and the language of science. Science and faith are two different languages that can work together to say the same thing and add a depth to our understanding and experience of God. We hope that we'll discover a richness in speaking both languages that draws us closer to God, because God is, after all, the creator of all, including science and everything we learn through science. So we started week 1 with a message, what I wish the church knew about being a scientist. And last week, we had a message, reading the word in the world. This week, we're talking about science and original sin. And next week, we'll wrap up this series with a conversation on where humans come from. Now, believe it or not, I'm pretty excited about this message. Pastor Tom and I have had numerous conversations about original sin over the past couple of years. And when we were exploring a website called BioLogos, which is a website devoted to the intersection of faith and science for inspiration on this topic, we came across an article about theories for original sin. And because Pastor Tom knew how I had been wrestling with this topic, he suggested I write this message so that I can work to articulate what I believe and where I'm at. So I'm going to tell you that this is a rather autobiographical message. What I'm going to share is not necessarily the final authority on original sin. In fact, I know that there are places in here that Pastors Tom and Mark would want to clarify or adjust. This is just a snapshot of where I'm at right now in my journey. It's not where I was before, and it may not be where I'm at in the future. But for those of you who have had a similar faith foundation, you may relate to a lot of what I share. And for those of you who have had a different faith background, I hope that you'll grow in compassion for those of us who have struggled with this concept of original sin. Now, maybe you're wondering what original sin and science have to do with each other. Today, we're going to explore two aspects of original sin and science. First, through natural science on one hand, and then through psychology on the other. So we're going to use these things to talk about where sin comes from. Let's start with natural science, which is a branch of science that deals with the physical world. Now, I'm leaning here on an article by Lauren Haarsma from biologos.com called Why the Church Needs Multiple Theories of Original Sin. Haarsma has a PhD from Harvard and did 5 years of postdoctoral research in neuroscience. And in this article, Haarsma reflects on what happens when a Christian examines the evidence that God used evolution to create human beings. Now, I just want to quickly note here that according to Biologos, there's very little debate in the scientific community about this broad characterization of evolution. And anyone who claims otherwise is either uninformed or deliberately trying to mislead. And that's from What is Evolution? You can go check out that article for more information on that. Now, among the first questions a Christian might ask after wrestling with evolution is, well, what about Adam and Eve? If sin came into the world through Adam and Eve, but humans were created as a result of evolution, then where did sin come from? Now, next week, Pastors Mark and Tom are going to have that conversation, a message that specifically focuses on whether there was a literal Adam and Eve and where humans come from. So I don't want to answer that question today. So whether Adam and Eve were literal humans through whom sin entered the world, I do believe that Haarsma's theories can help us to consider how sin entered the world with some new insight. So first scenario, Adam and Eve are recent representatives of humanity. In this scenario, Adam and Eve lived relatively recently, like a few thousand years ago. They're two literal people who have had an important interaction with God that leads to sin entering the world. But they're part of like a larger group of people. So they're not necessarily ancestors of humanity, but they are representatives of humanity. And as our representatives, their disobedience caused all of humanity to fall into sin. Scenario 2, Adam and Eve are ancient representative ancestors of humanity. In this, Adam and Eve lived many thousands of years ago. They're representative ancestors in that they were probably part of a group of people, maybe a tribe, but they also have a sort of ancestor kind of relationship with much of humanity. And in this circumstance, there would be a fairly distinct before and after in relationship to sin in the world. And then scenario 3, Adam and Eve's story in Genesis is a symbolic retelling of every human story. So here they're symbolic. They're retelling the story of every human who, over our long history, became aware of God's claims on how they ought to live and then disobeyed. Here, Adam and Eve are strictly symbolic and are invitations for us to reflect on our own lives rather than to look to the past. So these are different ways that we can take our understanding of scientific evolution and still hold on to the idea of original sin. And Haarsma suggests that we resist the urge to rush to a conclusion of which one of these makes most sense and let us live in the tension. Just as we have multiple theories for atonement, which is to say what actually happened for humanity when Jesus came to earth in the incarnation, lived, died, and was resurrected, it's appropriate for us to have multiple theories on the origin of sin. Okay, so that's our natural science approach to original sin. Brief overview, in part because it's really hard to go too much deeper into this topic without getting into a discussion on the origins of humanity. But before we move on to considering original sin from a human psychology and development perspective, let's pause here for a chat question. So if you're joining us online, put it in the chat or turn to someone around you. When you reflect on the different theories on original sin, which one catches your interest? Which one do you want to ask more questions about? Recent representatives, ancient representative ancestors, or symbolic? Take a minute and talk about it. Now, you may have noticed that up until now, I haven't really stopped to define sin. And I did that because the natural sciences portion of this message was focused on the way that sin came into the world. But now I want to talk about what psychology and human development reveal to us about original sin. And to do that, I really think that I do need to stop and put some definitions in place. So since we're part of a United Methodist Church, I thought I would start by going back to what the founder of the Methodist movement, John Wesley, had to say about original sin. He said, "But still in his flesh, in humanity's flesh, there dwelt no good thing. All his nature was purely evil. It was wholly consistent with itself and unmixed with anything of an opposite nature." Wesley asserts that in a person's natural state, there's nothing good. They're inherently evil through and through. And in fact, in a person's natural state, they're not even able to understand their need for salvation. And it's God's grace that goes before a person to open their eyes and strive with them that allows that person to embark on a journey of salvation. And that's what salvation is. It's a process. It's a journey. If you want to know more about that, I suggest you watch Pastor Tom's message on salvation from our July series, Churchy Words. Now, Wesley's definition of original sin is probably pretty close to the one that I grew up with. Although, again, I recognize that not everyone grew up with that understanding of nature and of humanity. For me, it's hard to disconnect sin from evil because sin always led to hell. Now, spoiler alert, and not the point of this message, but I don't believe in hell anymore, at least not eternal conscious torment. But when I did, I believed that sin meant I was worthy to burn in hell. And at that point, it's not important to me whether sin is missing the mark or sin is brokenness or sin is evil, because all of it requires intense punishment, hell. Now, in order to prove that all people experience this reality of sin and are therefore deserving of hell outside of God, some people have said something to the effect of, well, toddlers are jerks, and that's proof that we're all born sinful. I'm sure you've heard some version of this, like when a 2-year-old bites, well, that shows our sinful nature. When a child throws a tantrum, it's proof of our inherent selfishness. Kids are selfish and mean and jerks, and that's proof of original sin. Now, what's interesting about this is that when you observe the development of children who are autistic or develop atypically, children who don't bite or hit or yell, mine, you start to understand how important those actions actually are. Because when a child bites their peer who took a toy, they're testing a way to control their environment. They're saying with their actions, when you took my toy, it made me angry. They're saying, I don't like it. When a child throws a tantrum because they want a treat, they're communicating their anger and their disappointment with the tools that they have. These are developmentally appropriate actions. These are stepping stones to more mature ways of communicating anger, frustration, and desire. I believe that these are bids for connection, for survival, for care, and that adults have the job of providing coaching, scaffolding, and redirection so that children can learn more mature ways of communicating their needs. I've had so many personal experiences of making a mistake and the people around me assuming that I had bad intentions. And this started when I was a child. At 10 years old, a family member told me I wasn't a princess to sit on a pedestal to get out of helping out around the house. And the implication being that I was an entitled jerk of a kid. And this was even though I did the thing they asked for, I just joked about not wanting to do it. I had people talk to me about how my various actions communicated disrespect, when it was more likely that I was just in my own head and I didn't understand the direction that they were giving me. And especially like for when I got scolded for mistakes that I made, I began to internalize the belief that mistakes mean I'm bad, which has made it really hard for me to have a growth mindset. A growth mindset is marked by belief statements like, mistakes help me learn. Feedback is valuable, and asking things like, is this my best work? I improve with practice. I won't give up. A growth mindset is in contrast to a fixed mindset, which is marked by belief statements like, I need to avoid making mistakes. I'll never be that smart. I know best. This is good enough. I give up. A growth mindset is one that believes that our most basic abilities can be developed through dedication and hard work. And since brains and talents are just the beginning, I can acknowledge that I don't know how to do something, but I can learn. It's the power of the magical yet. I don't know how to do that yet. Now, I've often struggled with having a growth mindset because I learned that all mistakes were sin and worthy of punishment or correction. And on a spiritual level, that those mistakes made me worthy of hell. It was very difficult for a long time for me to take risks or to try new things because I was afraid of making mistakes. And even more than that, I was afraid of what those mistakes meant about me and my worth as a human, my goodness as a person. And to be honest with you, I still really struggle with this sometimes. This understanding of original sin that looks at kids and calls them bad is incredibly damaging. And I would argue that it causes many people a good amount of trauma when they're taught as children that they're bad. You could even say that this mindset is sinful in itself. My foundational identity as a child, as a teenager, was not beloved child of God, made in God's image and good. My foundational identity was sinner, deserving of hell. Recently, I found a journal that I kept the summer I turned 15, and I went on a mission trip to Malawi, which is in Africa. I had to raise support, and as the departure date grew near, I was close to my fundraising goal, but not quite there, and realized that I might not have any spending money. And I wrote this: I'm trusting God to bring in the extra money, and maybe He won't provide spending money to teach me not to procrastinate. I would deserve it. Of course, I deserve to burn in hell, so that's not saying much. Anyway, I'm very excited, and I cannot wait to see how God will use me this summer. It was so casual, such a given, and so bleak. And honestly, I read that, and I think it's a wonder that I'm still part of the church. This mindset, this deep-seated belief that humans are so sinful that they deserve eternal conscious torment, leads to a second statement that I want us to explore. Since you're inherently sinful, you can't trust your emotions, logic, or intuition. Instead, you should make decisions only based on the Bible. So if I believe that I'm inherently sinful, I'm broken, you might even say corrupted, then I can't trust myself. I can't trust my instincts. I can't trust my own reasoning. I can't trust my sense of knowing. And that cuts me off from myself. It disconnects me from my body. But the problem is that you can't really shut off your nervous system. So when you experience emotional pain and you ignore it, well, your body is still processing all of those stress hormones, but you're trying to continue on as if nothing's wrong. So many of us are completely cut off from ourselves. We're disconnected from our intuition, disconnected from our bodies, disconnected from our emotions. And so we move through life looking for ways to numb, hurting ourselves and hurting others. What if the thing that we call original sin is really something more like trauma? We've all heard it said that hurt people hurt people. So when the first person hurt someone else and they cast blame, they deflected, they lied. If the hurt person didn't take the time they needed to heal, chances are they hurt someone else. And this cycle of hurt could be easily understood as the legacy of original sin. I wonder if we take it a step further. Dr. Jennifer Goebbels is an associate professor at Augustana University, and her research is in reproductive physiology. She was interviewed in an article on BioLogos about epigenetics. Epigenetic markers, which control how and when genes are expressed, can be inherited, as well as influenced by the environment. So, genetic changes are happening because of the environment, and those changes can be inherited. Some of the environmental influences on epigenetic markers include severe stress. And these stressors, like child abuse, low socioeconomic status, being in a natural disaster, these stressors that a mother experiences during pregnancy affect epigenetic markers, which then change how the fetus's DNA is expressed. It makes them more susceptible throughout their lifetime to cortisol, which is a stress hormone. Now, this can lead to a cycle of stress affecting fetuses, which then affects adults, which then affects fetuses. It's a cycle. Now, before you get too discouraged, the good news is just as a stress-filled environment can cause epigenetic changes, so can healthy environments. But this is a cycle that affects generations for good or for harm. Let's pause here for another chat question. Have you ever heard or experienced these ideas that kids are bad, which proves people are bad, or that since people are bad, it means you can't trust yourself? Have you ever heard or experienced that? Take a moment and talk about that experience. I've talked a lot about the things that I disagree with, but I want to share something that might actually help us make some sense of this. Author and theologian Richard Rohr posits that sin is not so much something we do, but it's something that's done to us. Original sin tells you not to be shocked or even surprised at the tragic flaw in all of us. People must not be naive about corporate evil, nor should they waste time blaming anybody, including themselves or their mother and father. Imputing blame is not the point. Healing is. And you cannot heal something until you recognize that it's there. Now, even though we aren't looking to blame our parents, the reality, and Rohr says this, is that much of that pain is passed on to us through our parents and through their pain. Original sin then is the collective pain that hurts us all. And sanctification is healing. This path we're on is about healing our wounds and learning how not to transmit pain anymore. Healing from our collective pain is how we practice the 3 simple rules: do no harm, do good, stay in love with God. We stop harming ourselves and reconnect to our bodies, to our intuition, to our emotions. And we heal that connection, and we stop harming others in our reactivity. Now, this is easier said than done because after some trauma, our nervous systems can become overreactive. And this is where the support of a good therapist can be really important. I've been talking to my therapist this past year about retraining my nervous system so that I can experience more things in my life without my body telling me that I need to be in fight or flight. And that's the kind of work I'm talking about here. That's the kind of work that I need to do to stop harming myself. And then we do good by encouraging others to do this healing work. And we seek to correct and improve systems that are hurting people. And we stay in love with God, remembering that when God created the world, including us, God declared it good. That God made us for a relationship with God. God wants to be in a relationship with us. So hear God's delight in you today. You are a beloved child of God. You are made in God's image, and God has declared you very good.